The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Kuni. Thank you, Ambassador Rita. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here to share with you some thoughts and views on the enhancement of capacity building in the context of adaptation and in the broader context. So I will be addressing three main points. First, I will highlight the importance of capacity building. Why is it important that we want to deal with capacity building? And the second point, I will talk about the place of capacity building in the Paris Agreement and in the wider context of sustainable development. And then third point, I will finish with some key points that I think they are the key ingredients in making capacity building not just successful, but also sustainable. And in that part, I will also provide some key messages to developing countries in particular on what should be done to make sure capacity building is sustained and sustainable. So capacity building is important for various reasons. As Ambassador Rita said earlier, there are various difficulties that countries are facing, and they have to deal with so many obligations and mandates in various agreements, international multilateral agreements. But many developing countries still lack the capacity to undertake these actions, not just on climate change, but in other areas. And it's not surprising that many developing countries identified capacity building as a priority in their NDCs. So it is really fundamental in achieving the Paris Agreement. It's obvious. You need to have the capacity to be able to take the actions that are expected from you to help deliver the agreement. And as I said earlier, there's so many obligations out there. There are actually over 500 multilateral agreements that countries have to commit to with various mandates, various obligations, and various levels of complicity as well. So in the Paris agreements in particular, just to highlight very briefly some of the entities that most of you are probably familiar with, obviously the Paris Committee on Capacity Building, the Capacity Building Initiative for Transparency, and also issues to do with capacity in the context of education, training, and public awareness. Within the UNFCCC Convention, there are also other institutions who deal with capacity building, not just for adaptation, but for other areas as well. So adaptation, you have the Adaptation Committee, the Adaptation Fund Board. In the area of finance, you have the Green Climate Fund, obviously, which it's a readiness program that provides capacity to countries to bid for projects. And in the area of, on finance, you have the Global Environment Facility, obviously the GEF. And in adaptation, you have the Adaptation Committee, Adaptation Fund Board. And in technology, you have the Technology Executive Committee, the Climate Technology Center and Network. All these institutions deal with capacity building. Beyond that, you also have the national communications, the greenhouse gas inventories, and outside the conventions, you also have governments that deal with capacity building. You have UN agencies and other institutions beyond that as well. So the point I want to make from these slides here is that there is so much happening on capacity building and so many institutions and organizations working on capacity building. And if you look at the wider picture beyond just climate change, you also have the 2030 Agenda and its Sustainable Development Goals that also put an emphasis on capacity building as a means of implementation of these Sustainable Development Goals. So on the Paris Agreement, you have the NDCs. On the 2030 Agenda, you have the targets. We have the goals, obviously 17 goals, and the targets, 169 targets, and about 300 indicators. But the important thing about these two is that they're linked, actually. So you have a strong link between the NDCs and at least 154 SDG targets. And because they touch so many areas that are important to countries. And these are just some of the examples: agriculture, cities, transport, energy, water access, food security, etc. So capacity building here becomes important beyond just the question of climate change. And if you address capacity building in the context of the wider picture of sustainable development, obviously it will bring various benefits to the countries. And using the motto of the 2030 Agenda, to leave no one behind. So, the conclusion I want to draw from this and the message I want to make is that given this multitude of initiatives out there and the various objectives that the countries are facing, to make capacity building really successful, you have to make sure that the efforts are coordinated. There's so much happening there, you have to bring them under a platform or a way that can make it most helpful to countries. And when we talk about coordination, it's coordination between not just the providers, but the recipients and the various actors who are involved in capacity building. Why? Because this will bring a number of benefits. First, it will make it cost effective, and it will enhance the effectiveness of the support and the efforts that are provided. You heard earlier again that countries and regions are facing various priorities and have increased needs. Again, to be able to coordinate those efforts from the various institutions will help dealing with those increased needs. And in terms of development, capacity building is there to help the achievement of not just environmental goals, but also social and economic objectives that the countries are dealing with. So it becomes a much wider agenda and much wider purpose of capacity building than just climate change. And this brings me to the point that, and I think Ambassador Rita, you highlighted this earlier, and thank you for that we need actually to go beyond the current approaches for capacity building. And I think capacity building, in a sense, has failed, actually, really to achieve its objective for the long term, because we don't think about the long term for capacity building. We build capacity for a particular purpose, particularly for a particular time frame, and that's it. And there is a change in personnel, or change in government, or change in priorities, and then we start the whole thing again. And that's not effective and not productive. So I will deal with some key messages in a minute in terms of what needs to be done for that. And just to come specifically to the challenges again facing developing countries, here are the sectors that are relevant for adaptation. And you can see that already highlights really the complexity that you need to deal with in terms of ensuring effective capacity building. And if you look at the NDCs and what the countries, there's a large number of countries there highlighted adaptation as a priority. It's not surprising. So what they came up with, a series of priority areas there. Now, you can see there various sectors beyond obviously just climate change. You have health, agriculture, water, energy, fisheries, etc. Now, the point I want to draw from this is that when you look at these sectors, they are actually similar to the Sustainable Development Goals. So capacity building shouldn't be seen just in a linear objective, but they have other benefits as well, because climate change impacts really have an effect on all the aspects of sustainable development. And what this means in terms of adaptation is that the countries, in choosing their development path, they will affect their vulnerability and the need to address adaptation. So it's not just on climate change, but on sustainable path as well. So the 2 points I want to make from these slides going forward, first is some of the key conclusions really to draw from this. What is it that I think really makes key ingredients for sustainable capacity building? First, the country has to have the ownership. The country has to have the ownership in order to retain the capacity. It has to play that leading role in knowing exactly what is it that you want to have capacity on. And the capacity has to grow from within the country itself with the long-term vision. And the last point I want to make there with country ownership here is that obviously you have a large number of actors often really involved, but the international actors and those who support the country should not take a leading role. They should facilitate, they should support, but it's the country really who should own the process and manage it. The second point, as Ambassador Rita said, the approach, how to change it, I think we need to aim for an integrated approach from various aspects. First of all, in terms of coordination, it has to be between not just the donors, the initiatives, but the ministries. We know in various countries, unfortunately, the communication between various ministries is not as effective as it should be to make sure that the various efforts on capacity are actually productive and successful. And there should be also a two-way learning approach between those involved in capacity building. And take the example of countries. It's not just capacity building for the recipients, i.e. developing countries. Developed nations also have to have a capacity to understand how developing countries originate or produce their needs. What kind of strategies really work for the local context. There needs to be that understanding in terms of what would work and how you can mobilize actually the local resources to make sure that your efforts are productive. And the last point is, you can't know how effective your capacity building is unless you're able to evaluate it, review it, and maybe even change it. So the approach you're using for the next 2 years or 3 or so, priorities change. So you have to bear that in mind to be able to monitor, evaluate, and be able to be flexible so you can change the course through your program. So these in terms of some of the ingredients. And the last slide I want to make is some of the key messages to developing countries in terms of ownership. First, as I said, the country has to really assume that leading role. It is, in my opinion, really essential for the success of for ensuring capacity building. In terms of ND's implementation, well, obviously we have to be clear about capacity building for what? Why do we want to do capacity building? You have to be really clear and precise about that. And for whom? And then you have to differentiate between the hard and the soft capacities. The soft capacities are those related to policy dialogue, raising awareness. So there are things that could be quick win, but they enable the local communities in particular to appreciate the value of having capacity so you can have their buy-in to make sure that your program is successful. The second thing is in terms of engagement. Obviously, you have to engage everyone. And the local communities, their knowledge is absolutely critical in making sure that the capacity building is successful. And I know in some communities, the issue of language is also very important. There's so much material out there which is often available only in English, and that creates actually an issue of capacity. And we tend to underestimate that, but it's really important for people to understand the issues, to connect with them, and to take part actually in helping to implement them. Gender obviously goes without saying. You want to involve everyone. And gender issue also we tend to often underestimate. Raising public awareness is absolutely important. Education is one of the channels where you could educate everyone about why actually you need to adapt. And here I just want to raise the point about affecting people's behavior. Most of what we do actually in terms of processes and policies seem to be more or less easy to implement, but changing the way people use resources is much, much more challenging. So bearing that in mind when you're dealing with capacity building is to make sure that people understand the issues, connect with them, and see the values. And the last point I want to make is on the co-benefits. In terms of, again, of implementation and making sure the capacity building works, one channel, one opportunity is the South-South learning and cooperation. There's so many things between countries that they share in terms of culture, language, and other challenges that it makes sense to share resources, to have joint programs, and do something that is good for the region as a whole. And obviously, capacity building has to be integrated in the wider development plans. You can't just treat it in isolation. It will not work. It has to be part of a long-term vision, something that can deliver various benefits. And the last point is make sure that you target your needs in relation to the priority and the cross-cutting nature of the issue you're dealing with. There's so many issues out there, but the countries are at various levels of development and they have various capabilities, and that has to be taken into account. So when we talk about capacity building, don't assume that you have one approach is going to be working for everyone. So starting with the low-hanging fruit and something that can make high impact would be very useful. So I'll leave it here. I just wanted to flag up these key messages with the aim that they will help you with the panel discussion and the breakout session, and hopefully they will bring some food for thought. I think we still have some time. If there are any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your very insightful presentation, Zitouni. And now I will give the floor to our to all the I'm sorry to the audience. And so please, I welcome for your questions.
Don't be shy. Oh.
Yes, Guatemala, please.
Thank you very much for this presentation. I think that it covered the most important points that we already come in discussing in the process of this negotiation. But I just want to remind that when we talk about capacity building, we're talking to include another sectors, also in the government, the different actors in the executive powers, also in the legislative organism, because it's very important the role of the Congresses in the promotion and the fiscalization of the climate change actions, and also in the justice organism that we saw yesterday, a very good presentation of some cases of litigation in terms of climate change. And of course that, as you already mentioned, in the case of the another non-state actors of civil society, private sector, indigenous people also to take account and more than gender, indigenous people, young people. That's all. Thank you very much.
Sweden, please.
Thank you, Co-Chair, and thank you for this very rich presentation. We obviously get curious if maybe there would be some key messages, as we can see on the screen, also to developed countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Jamaica?
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Co-Facilitator, and thank you, Mr. Zitouni, for your excellent presentation. And obviously, you've taken time to get this information together. You've stated that a lot is happening with respect to capacity building initiatives, and you've given several examples of where this is happening. However, your first slide says that many countries still lack capacity to undertake climate action. Do you have any idea why this discontinuity, why some countries are still not having their capacity needs being addressed? Thank you.
Thank you, Jamaica. Zambia, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Facilitator. And also thank you to the presenter for a well-elaborated actual presentation, which has given insights on so many pertinent issues pertaining to capacity building. my intervention is based on the point that you raised when it comes to monitoring and evaluating the effectiveness of capacity building initiatives that have been implemented at maybe country level. Do you normally use the in-country systems in terms of monitoring, or you can come up with a deliberate framework to just target the monitoring and the evaluation of those particular capacity building initiatives? I'm saying that because this has been one of the issues that has been discussed in the negotiations, and on so many occasions, we as developing countries, in particular the least developed countries, we have actually talked about the aspect of coming up with the indicators to monitor the effectiveness of the capacity building initiatives that are being delivered in our respective countries, but this has not been welcomed. So I just wanted to find out what would be your take on this particular issue.
Thank you, Zambia. Ethiopia?
Thank you, Co-Chair, and thank you, presenter. It was an excellent presentation. Mine is a small question. You indicated about the need for greater coordination and cooperation between the provider and the recipient. Do you have any best case examples, or you also you mentioned about different platforms. Do you have any example to show us that something works better? Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Costa Rica?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Let me first congratulate you both, for your hard work, and wish you the best for the upcoming meeting. Just as it was expressed by some of my colleagues, from the view of my country, it's very important to, when we speak about engagement, when we speak not only about the multi-stakeholder nature, of the Durban, but also the multi-level that was mentioned by my colleague from Guatemala. How important this is going to be at the end in the national implementation of NDCs, particularly. As in terms of the engagement as well, we very much value the mention of the gender, the need to strengthen the gender engagement. But we should also strengthen the human rights engagement as well. In the sense that we need to ensure that what we are going to implement are going to respect are going to consider the respect and promotion of human rights in that international implementation also. And just like and in order to operationalize this, just like my colleague from Zambia mentioned, to advancing indicators is going to be key for us, and reflect all this. In that sense, reporting is going to be important also. So thank you. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Costa Rica. Burundi?
Thank you, co-facilitator, and thank you for the presentation made. It shows the importance of the capacity building and highlight the progress made. However, in some countries, in particular Africa, we still need capacity building as we saw the impact of climate change. And in terms of adaptation, we lack really capacities to prevent disaster and to adapt. So it means that the capacity made is not adequate. And I think also is the capacity building made have not take account the strengthening the institutions. And I appreciate that you highlight that we still need strong coordination, but also need to highlight that the capacity need and gap still have a problem to to be reached.
Thank you. Senegal?
Thank you, co-facilitator, and thank you for the excellent presentation. I'm quite delighted to see all the informations that are that were put forward, and that's exactly what have been covered by lead negotiators for the past year. So I'm happy to see that. But then I'll be happier to definitely see progress when it comes to indicators, as that was stated earlier by Zambia on behalf of the LDCs. We believe that there is so much that needs to be done. So much had been done, and we truly do appreciate that. But then there is a lot more that countries need to do when it comes to implementing NDCs, for instance. So a whole lot of stuff are actually lacking from developing countries, and I believe that will be definitely set, not only covered by finance, from the finance team, but also in a more coherent way, making sure that things had been covered in a certain way, and then whatever is left needs to be done in a different way, I believe. So I would definitely make an appeal to you and make sure that indicators are there to make sure that progress has been tracked in the most efficient way. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we have Japan, and then Togo would be the final question. Thank you.
Thank you for the co-facilitator. I have a very brief question regarding to the mitigation and adaptation. So do you have, and thank you for the great, excellent the presentation. I have a quick question regarding the mitigation and adaptation for the capacity building. Do you see any difference between the adaptation and mitigation to build the capacity? Do you have any differences between adaptation and mitigation to build the capacity? Thanks.
And Togo, please.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Facilitators, and thanks, Mr. Zitouni, for highlighting the importance of the capacity building. I would like to make a contribution on behalf of the LEG by saying that, by appreciating the presentation and share that the LEG also has undertaken many activities on capacity building, on formulating and implementation of NAPs, but they are still have a challenge or needs in least developing countries, like the difficulties by making process in accessing funding to formulate and implementing that from the GCF, by building also sufficient capacity for national entities to get accredited under the GCF, and how to manage or make synergy between NAPs and SDGs or other framework like TNIs, and also how to build on existing programs and activities in the national level, and putting together adaptation aspects of a strategic framework for engaging the GCF. So I would like to put a focus on the collaboration and cooperation between partners at the national, regional, and international level on focusing on adaptation, on the coordination of the capacity building activities. Thank you.
Thank you, Togo.
Togo has the floor. May I have another word, just one word to add? Yeah, I would like to thank the presenter. I would like to, in fact, to congratulate the presenters for this presentation, in fact. But I want to observe one important thing that I have on the screen right now. We have two important words, balance between hard and soft capacity. Usually, we used to have capacity building as workshops in the rooms. But according the hard aspect of the capacity building, I think we forgot it. So how do you think we shall use this opportunity to raise up very clearly how we can request some help for hard capacity building? Some activities are going on the floor, and we need maybe to see what is the problem there, how to correct it. I think this way is a very pragmatic way of capacity building. How to deal with this? Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. And we have one final question back there. If you could please introduce yourself.
Sure. My name is David Lapp. I'm with the World Federation of Engineering Organizations, and we've done some capacity building experience in Central and South America on adaptation. And I wanted to thank the presenter for an excellent presentation that I think reflects the experiences that we've seen and some of the points you've made. There's, I guess one of my question is around non-state actors, because I think that needs more clarification, and I would suggest, based on our experience, that it's best to try to deal with institutions within the country, and certainly with ourselves, we are practitioners, and I would suggest that another group to engage in developing countries, and for that matter, a message to developed countries, is to engage with practitioners in the country as a way of sustaining this, because you've got to build the knowledge. And I guess this last small point is that, you know, the best way for capacity building is the approach called learn by doing. Workshops are great. They certainly impart some knowledge, but it's really when you want to work, you really got to work on projects and that sort of thing to really, I guess, make sure it sticks. So just a small point. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. Mr. Zitouni.
Well, thank you everyone for really very helpful questions. So I'm not going to answer all of them. You'll be pleased to know. So you've got the panel and the breakout sessions who will address most of them. I'm just going to pick up a couple and highlight some points I didn't have a chance to manage in my presentation and respond to these questions. The question from Sweden in particular on key messages for developed countries, I did touch on some of those in terms of coordination between the various ministries and the donors and initiatives, and also the fact that capacity building has to be two ways. So you have to understand the local context and how you can make capacity building works better by engaging the local actors. So you shouldn't play a leading role, but actually empower the local people to take ownership of their own development so they can develop in the way that suits them. The second point that was mentioned by Zambia and Senegal is really pertinent one about the measurement and reporting and the use of indicators. So you're absolutely right. You need to be able to have some kind of measurement of your capacity building for adaptation or other activities. In other fora, in other areas like the Sustainable Development Goals, there are indicators being used to be able to assess the progress. Now, in the case of capacity building, obviously, is more difficult, and for adaptation is even more difficult. So perhaps the indicators have to be qualitative rather than quantitative or maybe a mixture of both. But that's something that has to be thought by the experts, and maybe in relation to local context as well, what would be the best way that can allow you to assess the progress. Indicators, yes, is definitely one of the means that can do that. The last point is with regard to the point made by Costa Rica for the engagement, and that was raised by other people as well, in terms of engaging the non-state actors, practitioners or others. Absolutely, I totally agree. And Costa Rica, you highlighted the point of human rights engagement. And you're absolutely right, because development is the right for everyone. And everyone should be involved in having a say, making sure that you have a development in a place where you live. It could be related to water security, food security, or other aspects. So you're right, human rights engagement has to be included as well. So I think the conclusion from this is that all the points you raised, they do actually highlight the complexity of the issue. There's so many issues, obviously, to be addressed in capacity building. But we have to be, again, coming back to the approach, we have to be more smart about it in trying to see what would make capacity building work in various contexts, and not to see it just as one approach that is going to be working across the board. So that would be the last message I think I'll leave you with. And the other question you raised, they're all pertinent, and I'm sure they will be nicely addressed in the breakout session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zitouni, and you did the wonderful job as the setting the scene for the whole discussion. That also obviously went so well because we already got lots of questions and interest and comments from the parties and also from the participants. But that things will get only better world. So it means actually next we will work on the panel discussion, and now we will start to have the more focused discussion. And we will have the three panelists who will each address this designated subtopic of the forum. For subtopic number 1,